A child sits on a cold stone bench in a windowless room, knees drawn to a thin dress, fingers tracing mortar as if that could map a way out. The noise beyond the shuttered door is political, shouting, the clash of armour. But what reaches this small body is hunger and a steady administrative cruelty. Measured rations, a list of names, the ledger of guilt. The child does not understand treason, only absence. A father gone, servants reduced, the household trimmed like rope. Her playthings are gone, letters arrive and are unreadable because they speak of land, debts and retribution. The child hears the phrase that will shape her life, an arranged destiny in which her body and her name are units of exchange. This is punishment made precise and domestic. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. From that cramped certainty, the outline of Elizabeth de Badlesmere begins. Born to Bartholomew de Badlesmere and Margaret de Clare, she entered the world into the management of noble advantage. Her family held office and estates. Her life was immediately legible in political currency. The marriage contract that would follow refused the ambiguity of childhood and placed her within a web of alliances and rivalries that could not be undone by tears. Her first union was arranged when she could not walk unaided. The ceremony would be recorded in a chapel roll, a paper trace of a bargain sealed by clerical words. The immediate human cost went unrecorded in official returns. The child who would be married at 3 and later confined at 8. The quiet chronology of losses that their household would call collateral damage. Historians later found these entries in chancery and church registers. The administrative handwriting maps the same cold logic the child felt in her bones. Her name is small in those records, but it persists, threaded through legal returns, papal letters, and inventories of plate and land. It is an early lesson. Survival in this world depends less on kindness and more on pedigree, on whether kin can gather to protect you when the crown notices your father's rebellion. The contract that bound Elizabeth at 3 to Sir Edmund Mortimer was not romantic but political. It was enacted in a chapel at Ernwood in Kinlet, Shropshire, on June 27, 1316. The boy she married likely ranged from 10 to 15 years old. Both were children in body and instruments in politics. Contemporary practice permitted such unions as a means to cement alliances between magnates. The marriage would not be consummated until both reached maturity, yet its legal reality mattered immediately. Entailments, wardships, and rights of custody followed the signing of a parchment and the exchange of vows. Roger Mortimer, Edmund's father, was a rising force. A tie to Mortimer family interests offered protection and promise to Bartholomew de Badlesmere's line. The document for the union survives only in references, mentions in manorial rolls and later genealogical compilations. It shows how noble families used children as stock in a market of influence. For Elizabeth, this meant a life measured in the calculus of advantage. Her personal authority was nascent. The household that reared her remained under her mother's direction until events unstitched their security. Yet these early days also consolidated claims that would prove durable. When fortunes shifted and names were stripped from placards, that marriage would be cited for rights and succession. Even child brides could become linchpins in inheritance disputes decades later. The Mortimer alliance would propel Elizabeth into a different orbit, exposing her to the better rooms of power and the greater stakes of noble rivalry, where a single rebellion could unmake a family and consign children to cold cells. Elizabeth's childhood, even before the siege that would alter her family permanently, was routinely interrupted by the mechanics of lordship. Rents collected, nights arranged, and feasts scheduled to announce alliances. Bartholomew de Badlesmere served as steward in the royal household, an office that put him close to the machinery of kingship. Margaret de Clare, his wife, was herself of a powerful line, niece to an earl, and accustomed to the expectation that noble women administer estates and enforce household discipline. Their daughter's early education would have been practical, reading for prayer, estate accounts, and the management of a retinue. Yet the household's political choice, participation in baronial resistance, altered that training into something harsher. The refusal at Leeds Castle to admit a queen's retinue was not a minor social slight. It was an intentional assertion of authority by Margaret that signalled a willingness to contest royal privilege. Chroniclers record the event bluntly: a refusal, an attack on the Queen's men, and an immediate escalation. Such local acts of defiance were recorded not for their cruelty but for their consequences. The records that survive are punitive ledgers and rolls of siege. For Elizabeth, who still navigated the small world of chambers and chapels, that refusal marked the household as vulnerable. The politics of her parents would become the legal grounds for her own imprisonment and her family's dispossession. The siege that followed the refusal did not read like a pageant. Contemporary chronicles emphasise its speed and brutality. Forces loyal to the crown moved against Leeds Castle, and Bartholomew de Badlesmere's alignment with rebellious peers placed the family under suspicion. Legal writs, orders to seize property, and punitive fines followed. Bartholomew joined a coalition that opposed certain royal favourites and policies. In the political atmosphere of the time, such alliances were fatal when the balance of power shifted. The family seat faced confiscation. Margaret de Clare and her children, including an 8-year-old Elizabeth, were taken into custody. Contemporary administrative records record their transfer to the royal custody that the kings of England used for noble prisoners. Imprisonment of noble women and children was hardly rare, but it was precise, a means to display the crown's reach and to deny the rebel household leverage. For Elizabeth, the incarceration was formative. The records show not only an entry in a ledger but also later petitions and accounts that reference the costs of maintaining noble prisoners. Those dry administrative notes are the basis for reconstructing hours of fear and the slow arithmetic of deprivation during confinement. The legal process that led to Bartholomew de Badlesmere's execution unfolded in the ordinary language of treason trials: indictments, attainders, estates forfeit to the crown. The parliamentary rolls and chancery petitions document a sequence of judgments that culminated in the stripping away of title and property. In this procedure, the personal is translated into paperwork, lists of manors, valuations, the names of heirs excluded by attainder. Execution for treason was the state's ultimate instrument. It removed a head from its social body and redistributed its assets. For Elizabeth, the consequence was immediate and material. Lands that had supported her upbringing were seized, wardships shifted. Her marriage connections became essential, not for affection, but for the restoration of any claim. Contemporary chroniclers note the cruelty of executing a baron, but their records are also concerned with the redistribution that followed. Who receives which manor, which household? The child's losses were catalogued alongside the land being transferred. Her mother's status degraded into a custody problem for the crown. Margaret de Clare's person was detained and her children became, in the records, property to be administered. The Tower of London looms in the administrative record as a repository for high-profile prisoners. The evidence for Elizabeth's confinement there comes from custodian rolls and household returns that list noble wards and their costs. The Tower was less a dramatic cell in the popular imagination and more a managed residence for those whose detention required official notice. For a child of 8, however, the reality was abrasive. Movement restricted, company limited to household retainers approved by royal officers, and a childhood interrupted by visitation lists and interrogations of adult kin. The Tower's records include payments for food, for bedding, and occasionally for the child's schooling or medical care. These entries permit historians to reconstruct an ordinary chronology of confinement, seasons passing, household members reassigned, and political negotiations continuing outside those walls. The imprisonment was both punishment and leverage, negotiation currency in the crown's hands. For Elizabeth, later historians have argued, the experience left an indelible mark. It informed her understanding of power, of the fragility of noble privilege, and of the necessity, often enforced by marriage, of aligning with families whose fortunes might protect hers in turn. Release from custody did not automatically restore a formerly noble household. After Roger Mortimer's intervention and his rise to power, Elizabeth's circumstances shifted dramatically. Mortimer's ascendancy altered the legal architecture that had condemned her family. Pardons, reversals of attainder, and restoration of estates followed. Documents from the period note petitions and grant rolls that returned property to formerly dispossessed families when political winds changed. For Elizabeth, this meant movement from constrained custody to a place within one of the most powerful households in the realm. While in confinement she had been a dependent on the crown, after Mortimer's success she became a beneficiary of his triumph. The same documents that record baronial execution also record the later grants that restored lands and titles. Those legal reversals are cold in the language of Chancery, but they describe a change in daily reality. Larger rooms, more servants, and the rituals of court life replacing the austerity of a prison diet. That shift was not mere comfort, it was reintegration into the networks that determined marriage markets, inheritance, and political standing. Yet Mortimer's power rested on precarious foundations that would later expose Elizabeth to further instability. Living in Mortimer's household gave Elizabeth visibility and protection for a time. Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, exercised power at the centre of government after the overthrow of Edward II, becoming the de facto ruler. Chronicles from the period detail Mortimer's influence and the circulation of his clients and kin into positions of profit. For Elizabeth, the association brought privileges, household retinues, marriage prospects for her children, and political connections that could not be purchased. It also placed her within a family whose prominence would make it a target when factions reformed. The Mortimers' hold on power attracted enemies at court, and their rise reinvented the family as both patron and potential prisoner. The documents that describe the distribution of office and patronage are explicit. Grants of land, stewardship appointments, and marriage arrangements. This proximity to authority shows how quickly restoration could turn into exposure. Elizabeth's life illustrates that noble rehabilitation after a fall remained dangerously conditional on the fortunes of those above them. The fall of Roger Mortimer in 1330 was swift and decisive. Taken in a coup orchestrated by the young King Edward III, Mortimer was arrested, tried, and executed. Official records of the arrest, parliamentary verdicts, and the execution itself survive in royal rolls and in contemporary chroniclers who describe the spectacle. Mortimer's fall had immediate repercussions for his household and dependents. Edmund Mortimer, Elizabeth's husband, found his prospects narrowed as the political capital that had protected him vanished. The legal consequences extended beyond the executed Earl to his sons and clients. Property claims reversed once again, patronage withdrawn, and those tied to Mortimer exposed to reprisal. For Elizabeth, this reversal meant the reactivation of vulnerabilities thought to have been neutralised. The life made possible by Mortimer's rule could be taken away by the Crown's determination to reassert authority. Records of confiscation demonstrate a pattern. When a magnate fell, the Crown reclaimed lands and redistributed them to loyal followers, and the women and children of the fallen were often left to negotiate the fragments. Edmund Mortimer's death shortly after his father's execution further unsettled Elizabeth's position. Whether he died of illness or other causes in late 1331 or early 1332, the result was the same. Elizabeth became a widow with 2 young sons, Roger and John. The Inquisition post-mortem and other legal records later identify her children and their claims. The elder son, Roger, would eventually inherit the title as the 2nd Earl of March, but as a minor his household and lands required guardianship and management. Widows in Elizabeth's position faced immediate legal questions: who would hold wardship, who would manage the estates, and which marriages would secure the children's futures. Her legal status as widow and mother placed her in a position of negotiation with other noble houses. This was the paradox of noble life. Tragedy could convert into agency when properly navigated, but it also left a widow exposed to the designs of men who could profit from her children's minority. Surviving accounts show petitions and settlements. They map the practical work required to keep a medieval lineage intact after successive shocks. Elizabeth's second marriage to William de Bohun in 1335 was a strategic calculation that required a papal dispensation because of kinship ties between the Mortimer and Bohun lines. The dispensation itself survives in ecclesiastical registers, a bureaucratic imprint of a private decision. William de Bohun was an experienced military commander and a man of significant standing. The union healed a previous enmity between families and provided protection to Elizabeth and her sons. Marriage to Bohun elevated Elizabeth to the rank of countess, bringing with it both security and new responsibilities. The marriage negotiated the immediate problem of guardianship and offered a patron whose closeness to royal service could shield her children's inheritances. For Bohun, the match consolidated his position among the leading magnates of the realm. Records of land transactions and household accounts after 1335 show the integration of Elizabeth's interests into Bohun estates and the careful reallocation of income to provide for heirs of both lines. The union of Elizabeth and William de Bohun also altered genealogical trajectories in ways historians recognise as consequential. Their son Humphrey, born in 1342, would eventually inherit multiple earldoms and marry into the web that led to royal contention. Their daughter Mary's marriage several generations later produced Mary de Bohun, who married Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV. This link is one of the routes by which Elizabeth's blood entered the line of kings. Court records, marriage contracts, and later pedigree charts trace these connections with a businesslike clarity. For Elizabeth, the marriage to Bohun was both a personal transition from widowhood back into political life, and a strategic measure with long-term consequences. Property settlements show how dowries and jointures were arranged to secure the future of children from both her first and second marriages. The administrative traces left behind, writs, royal confirmations and ecclesiastical permissions, form the factual backbone for understanding how a woman married at 3 could ultimately anchor a genealogical line to the throne. Elizabeth's role as mother and household manager under William de Bohun is visible in account rolls and in property transactions that required a woman's signature or consent. Noble women frequently oversaw estates, managed servants, arranged marriages for younger kin, and directed the spiritual patronage of churches. Elizabeth's position required such governance. Surviving records show grants to religious houses and endowments that indicate she took an active part in shaping the family's public presence. Her will, made on May 31, 1356, reflects that managerial role. It itemizes bequests and requests for burial, showing both piety and an awareness of the symbolic uses of burial spaces. The will's language is pragmatic: directions for masses, distributions of goods, and care for dependents. It was the legal culmination of a woman's earthly jurisdiction, recorded in notarial hands and sealed as a public document. The existence of such a will provides historians with direct testimony to her priorities in the last months of life. The children of Elizabeth's second marriage further anchored her in the political fabric. Humphrey de Bohun, their son, inherited substantial titles and lands and became a key magnate in the following generation. His marriage alliances and progeny extended Elizabeth's influence by blood. Elizabeth de Bohun, their daughter, married Richard Fitzalan, 11th Earl of Arundel, further reinforcing the family's reach. Pedigree rolls and heraldic visitations record these unions in bureaucratic detail. These documents are neither flattering nor intimate. They function as legal proof of descent and entitlement. For Elizabeth de Badlesmere, being the nexus of these relationships meant her early victimization had transformed into a generative position. Through her offspring, she established durable bonds. Yet the administrative records also remind us that these bonds were not solely emotional. They were instruments of policy. Marriage was a political technology. Through it, Elizabeth converted an unstable childhood into a lineage that would matter to kings and magnates in the century that followed. The status of co-heiress, after her brother Gilles de Badlesmere's death in 1338, reinforced Elizabeth's economic footing. Giles's death without heirs distributed Badlesmere claims among surviving sisters. Inquisitions post-mortem and felons' rolls document the partition and the subsequent confirmations of rights. Being a co-heiress increased Elizabeth's legal capital, expanding her claim to manors and rents that bolstered the Bohun estate and her own household. These technical procedures, valuations, disputes over boundaries, and the final issuance of writs confirming ownership are the granular facts historians piece together to reconstruct the skeleton of noble power. Her co-heirship also had political consequences, property translated into men and influence, and every manor added to a lord's retinue and resources for war or patronage. The legal apparatus that sorts inheritance was indifferent to childhood trauma. It counted acres and obligations, not emotions. For Elizabeth, the settlement meant a measure of financial resilience that would influence her family's standing for decades. In the later years of her life, Elizabeth acted within the available channels of influence: patronage of religious houses, settlement negotiations, and the management of dowries for younger relations. Her request to be buried at the Church of the Black Friars in London, recorded in her will and in subsequent monastic registers, reflects both spiritual concerns and social positioning. Burial in a prominent religious house was an assertion of status and a tool for memory. Archaeological surveys and monastic records provide corroboration. Precinct boundaries, burial registers, and, where they survive, descriptions of tombs offer physical corroboration of documentary claims. While many friaries were later dissolved and their tombs disturbed, the documentary traces remain. Elizabeth died at Rochford, Essex on June 8, 1356. The timing, laid down in chronicles and in her will's dating, closes a life that began as a political instrument and ended as a matriarch of dynastic lines. Legal materials that mention Elizabeth, writs, grants, and papal dispensations are the scaffolding historians use to reconstruct a life otherwise invisible in narrative history. Primary sources show the make and break of noble fortunes, the roll that records the marriage at Ernwood, the Tower's custodial accounts, Mortimer's grant rolls, and Bohun's household books. These texts are not neutral. They were written by administrators invested in property and authority. Yet together, they allow a clear narrative. A girl married as part of an alliance, imprisoned with her family, restored and elevated, then married again into a house that repaired and advanced her fortunes. Each act of the state left an imprint. Archaeological evidence, sites associated with the Badlesmere estates, chapel foundations at Ernwood, and the Blackfriars precinct adds material confirmation. Where stones persist and charters mention a chapel, the combination of written and material evidence strengthens the factual basis for reconstruction. Elizabeth's experience illuminates the role of noble women in a decade marked by faction and frequent regime change. Her life was not unusual in the mechanics it exposes: noble children used in alliances, women imprisoned to secure kinsmen's behaviour, and widows negotiating guardianship and remarriage. But her descendants' prominence gives her historical weight. The Mortimer and Bohun lines she connected have consequences for later royal claims and conflicts. The lineage that moved from her small body up through Humphrey de Bohun and later into the Lancastrian claim is a direct route by which private family tragedy intersects with national politics. Documents like marriage contracts and Inquisition records show this transmission in plain terms. Rents, knights' fees, and the right to the castle town are passed down. These dry facts, multiplied across generations, produce the conditions for later dynastic struggle. The human toll remains visible when we read the administrative record for its omissions as much as for what it states. The entries that list the sequestration of goods, payments for prisoners, and the transfer of manors are also records of separation. Mothers removed from household authority, children dispersed into wards, and the private grief of a widow reduced to a notation about dower. Elizabeth's era was marked by such ruptures. The networks that could hold a family together were fragile and contingent on political favour. The fact that her first marriage was contracted at 3, and that she likely bore her first child in adolescence is not sensational for the period. It was systemic. The records about ages, baptismal references, and marriage contracts show how early the responsibilities of reproduction and dynastic continuity began for noble girls. This was not romanticised in its time. It was administrative, a sequence of duties recorded alongside manorial accounts. Yet the record also shows resilience. Elizabeth navigated widowhood, remarriage, estate management, and the placement of her children into marriages that would secure their futures. Her will's specificity, its lists of alms and bequests, indicates a woman who exercised agency within the structures available to her. She directed resources, favoured religious institutions, and sought a particular burial place, the Blackfriars in London, choice that would position her memory within a civic and spiritual network. The physical remnants of that network, foundations, documentary mentions, and later antiquarian descriptions of tombs, permit a more textured sense of how she wanted to be remembered. That intention is itself part of the historical record, a late medieval noblewoman arranging her narrative through legal instruments. The genealogical importance of Elizabeth's unions is measurable in the pedigrees and in the succession disputes that came centuries later. The Mortimer and Bohun lines fed marriages into the houses that would contest the throne during the Wars of the Roses. Historians tracing claims find Elizabeth's name in the branches that lead to contenders and to kings. Pedigree rolls and heraldic visitations, although compiled later, rely on earlier charters and on surviving registers to confirm descent. These sources are documentary architecture. They organise relations into claims that could be advanced in court or on the battlefield. Elizabeth's role as mother in 2 influential houses makes her an important node in that network. It is a sober fact that a girl married at 3 and a mother at 14 could, through her children and grandchildren, be a progenitor of royal contention. The arithmetic of inheritance converts private sorrow into national consequence. The social mechanisms that enable such transmission are bureaucratic and relentless. Wardship records show guardians collecting rents for minors, marriage licenses show alliances being brokered to settle debts and secure loyalties, and inquisitions post-mortem distributed property according to clear rules. Elizabeth's life appears in these procedural documents precisely because she participated in them as a party, a petitioner, and a respondent. Her petitions for property, the papal application for her second marriage, and the notation of her burial wishes are all administrative acts that leave traces. When read together, they provide firm evidence for the sequence of events historians narrate: marriage at 3, imprisonment, widowhood, remarriage, motherhood, and a will directing burial and legacies. The absence of private letters limits our access to sentiment, but the procedural record is detailed enough to render the arc of a life. The lived experience of noble childhood and adolescence in Elizabeth's time is best reconstructed by triangulating administrative records with household accounts, religious practice, and material culture. Clothing inventories list garments that indicate status and the kinds of labour expected of noble girls. Devotional books and chapel appointments show the shape of daily spiritual life, and feasting and retinue lists demonstrate how households projected power. For Elizabeth, these elements combined with political events to form a life of alternating vulnerability and advantage. Her early marriage is, in those sources, a policy choice recorded among other policy choices. The dry language of roles obscures the daily familiarity of change, how a child adapted to a new household, learned to read accounts, or manage servants. Yet it is possible to reconstruct the mechanics. This reconstruction is not speculative fantasy. It relies on sources that document the material conditions of noble life in detail. The transition from one household to another also meant changes in patronage patterns. Elizabeth's alignment with Mortimer and later Bohun connected her to different networks of patronage, each with its own obligations and benefits. Men like William de Bohun owed service and loyalty to the crown, and their households functioned as nodes of royal military and administrative power. When Elizabeth entered such a household, she became part of its diplomatic circuits, marriages arranged, retinue lists maintained, and alliances formalized. This is visible in financial papers, payments for men-at-arms, expenses for travel to court, and fees for marriages that required dispensation. The documentary trail is technical, but it describes precisely how noble families secured their positions through reciprocal obligations and formalized ties. Elizabeth's movement between these houses is therefore both personal and procedural. Religious patronage formed an important component of noble identity. Elizabeth's request to be buried at the Black Friars in London must be read in this context. Burial in a friary or priory was a claim about spiritual care and social standing. Monastic registers and the friars' own records sometimes note benefactions and intercessory obligations. They also served as repositories of memory. For Elizabeth, the choice of burial site was also a public statement about her identity and the network she inhabited. The friary would perform masses for her soul, and the survival of such commemorative practice contributed to a family's social memory. Archaeological work on friary precincts and the occasional survival of tomb markers corroborate documentary statements and provide the material context that bolster written evidence. The placement of a tomb within a religious house was part of a strategic plan for posthumous reputation. The politics of memory meant that family historians and antiquaries, centuries later, would cite Elizabeth's burial and her will as evidence of lineage and status. Her will's instructions about masses and alms were ordinary in form but consequential in effect. They created obligations that ensured the family would be remembered and prayed for in a public, institutional manner. These practices reinforced the social web that sustained noble families beyond literal lifespans. In addition, the survival of record copies in monastic and municipal archives helped later genealogists piece together lineages that mattered to claims of honour and property. Elizabeth carefully articulated requests in her will, thus operated on two registers: spiritual care and dynastic continuity. The archival traces that survive, parchments recording marriages, dispensations, inquisition returns, and the will itself, show a woman who navigated the legal instruments of her age. Her will's existence on May 30th, 1356, and her death at Rochford on June 8, 1356, are fixed points that bracket her last decisions. The will supplied explicit instructions for liturgical commemoration and material distribution, which were standard but also revealing for personal priorities. For historians, wills are unusually candid legal acts. They enumerate possessions, name beneficiaries, and often provide unexpected data about domestic arrangements. Elizabeth's will is a clear example. It supplies evidence of the people she favoured, the religious institutions she patronised, and the objects she considered important. In the absence of private letters, such documents are essential for reconstructing the intentions of medieval noblewomen. Archaeological work on sites associated with the Badlersmere and Bohun estates supplements the documentary story. Excavations of manor houses, chapel foundations at places like Ernwood, and the archaeological remains of friary precincts produce material evidence that corresponds with written accounts. Finds such as decorated tiles, fragments of tomb ornament, and in some cases carved effigies corroborate the presence of noble patrons. While many medieval sites have been altered, the combination of textual and material evidence strengthens historical claims. For Elizabeth, the combination of charter evidence and archaeological context gives a firmer sense of the spaces she inhabited and the institutions she supported. These are useful reminders. History is composed not only of names in roles, but of places where people lived, prayed, and were buried. The later significance of Elizabeth's progeny is not a matter of retrospective romanticism, but of legal and political fact. The genealogical connections she established through her marriages placed her descendants in positions that mattered to claims of succession. The Mortimer claim, transmitted through her first marriage, later furnished a basis for contention in the 14th and 15th centuries. Similarly, the Bohun inheritance fed into marriages that linked to Lancastrian interests. The bureaucratic record, pedigrees, marriage settlements, and inquisitions documents how these inheritances were assembled and contested. The consequences were not merely noble pride, they structured the alignments that produced civil conflict. Elizabeth's name appears in this documentation as a connective tissue between houses whose interests would shape English politics for generations. The archival continuity that preserves those links is remarkable. Rolls and visitations compiled in later centuries rely on earlier charters and on preserved registers. They reconstruct family trees that mattered to landholders and to the crown. The Mortimer and Bohun connections are thus visible across chronological layers of record-keeping. Her descendants' claims to titles and lands were adjudicated through those documents. The dry mechanics, heralds' visitations, inquisitions post-mortem, and parliamentary petitions are the mechanisms by which genealogy turned into political leverage. Elizabeth's role is not ornamental. Her marriages and offspring materially shaped which families could advance claims, build retinues, and press advantage when royal authority weakened. The story of Elizabeth de Badlersmere also highlights the gendered dimensions of political vulnerability. Noble women were instruments of alliance, but also actors with legal standing who could manage estates and direct patronage. Their value as wives and mothers made them targets for manipulation, but their legal capacities, widow's dower, the right to dispose of certain goods, and the authority to found religious bequests, gave them tools to secure family continuity. Elizabeth used those tools. She negotiated a papal dispensation to remarry, she managed the transition of properties, and she arranged her will to ensure specific commemorations. These acts show planning and agency within constrained choices. Her life therefore complicates a simple narrative of victimhood. She was both subject to political violence and an operative in its aftermath. That said, the repeated shocks she endured, imprisonment as a child, the execution of her father, the fall of powerful patrons and early widowhood, cannot be reduced to administrative inconvenience. The records that list payments for the care of prisoners and the costs of maintaining noble households also gesture towards psychological and social damage, ruptured networks, reputational harm, and the precariousness of authority. The archival silence on interior life forces historians to read between the lines of petitions and transactions. Those silences are telling, where an inventory lists broken plate or missing servants, or where a household roll notes diminished retinue numbers, the implication is loss felt in practical and social dimensions. Elizabeth's responses to those losses, marrying again, consolidating claims, and endowing religious houses, are evidence of resilience enacted through institutional channels. Primary sources that most directly inform Elizabeth's biography include chancery rolls, manorial accounts, papal registers, inquisitions post-mortem, and monastic chronicles. Each genre serves a function. Chancery rolls record royal decisions, manorial accounts show daily economic life, papal registers document dispensations that permitted marriages otherwise prohibited by consanguinity, inquisitions post-mortem detail inheritance after death, and chronicles provide narrative frames often coloured by political perspective. Taken together, they create a multi-layered documentary portrait. Where archaeological work can locate chapels, friaries, and manor sites, the material record corroborates and complicates the textual evidence. For instance, the chapel at Ernwood where the marriage took place is attested in charters. Its foundations, if traced, would be another corroborating link. This is the historian's method: assemble, compare, and account for silences and biases in the archive. The biases in those sources are visible and must be acknowledged. Chroniclers favoured moral lessons and political commentary. Legal documents prioritised property and obligation. Monastic registers were concerned with benefactors and salvation. The result is partial vision. Yet despite those limits, the documentary corpus for Elizabeth's life is sufficiently rich to form a coherent narrative. That coherence is not inevitable. It depends on cross-checking dates, names, and places across genres. When registers concur on the marriage at Ernwood, the Tower custody, the papal dispensation for remarriage, and the will's burial request, the convergence builds confidence. Where disagreement appears, historians weigh the provenance of each source. The result is a factual account that foregrounds institutional detail rather than speculation. The moral weight of Elizabeth's story lies in what it reveals about medieval power. It was administered through paperwork, exercised through marriages, and enforced through the removal of property and person. The instruments of that power were bureaucratic and routine, writs, rolls, and seal impressions. Yet their effects were immediate and human. A child bound by contract at 3, confined at 8, widowed in her teens, and remarried as a tool of alliance is not an exceptional tragedy, but a paradigm of noble life stakes in a violent polity. When historians read those administrative traces with careful attention to context, they reconstruct not merely events, but an environment in which legal forms were the main means by which fate was decided. Elizabeth's life is a case study in that environment, the intersection of policy and intimacy, of law and livelihood. The later prominence of Elizabeth's descendants does not erase the injustices she endured. It complicates them. Her bloodline rose to influence and even royalty in later centuries, but the instruments used to secure that position, marriage contracts, wardships, and managerial control of inheritance, were themselves tools of coercion. The political utility of her body and her children was the currency of noble negotiation. That historical fact is neither romantic nor reducible to simple villainy. It is structural. Documents that record negotiations over land, dowries, and wardships thus appear less as neutral accounting than as the ledger of enforced choices that shaped lives. Historiography has at times marginalised figures like Elizabeth, treating them as footnotes to male actors. Recent scholarship has shifted to place women's experiences more centrally, relying on the same administrative base, but interpreting the evidence for agency and constraint. Studies of noble childhood, wardship, and female patronage have reframed how we read marriage contracts and wills. In Elizabeth's case, historians have focused on how her marriages served dynastic ends, and how her management of property affected subsequent generations. The methodological shift emphasises the procedural records not only as evidence of oppression but as evidence of strategic action. It is a sober, documentary reassessment rather than sentimental reclamation. Public memory and genealogical narratives have also altered Elizabeth's shadow. Antiquaries and family historians who compiled pedigrees in later centuries elevated genealogical links to claims of honour. Public histories have occasionally turned those lines into patriotic narratives of royal descent. The sober administrative reality, lists of rents and the minutiae of legal acts, has been transformed into stories of blood and right. Historians push back by insisting on the archival record's limits, and by highlighting the ways ordinary administrative instruments shaped extraordinary political outcomes. Elizabeth emerges in that work as both a product of institutional constraint and as an actor operating within those constraints to secure her family's continuity. The final accounting of Elizabeth de Balasmere's life is a matter of documents and descendants. She was married at 3 at Ernwood, became mother in adolescence, was imprisoned with her family in the Tower, saw her father executed for treason, lived in Mortimer's household during his ascendancy, became a widow with 2 sons, remarried William de Bohun by papal dispensation in 1335, bore children who tied her to the future Lancastrian line, and died at Rochford on June 8, 1356. Her will of May 31, 1356, requested burial at the Blackfriars in London. These are facts verified across chancery rolls, papal registers, Inquisition returns, and monastic records. They compose a trajectory from political instrument to dynastic matriarch. The human detail between these facts, fear, calculation, adaptation, remains largely unrecorded, but the administrative traces are clear enough to reconstruct the arc of a life shaped by the pressures of noble politics. In the end, Elizabeth's life is a ledger of medieval power, the early entry of a child into political obligation, the recurrent loss and recovery of property through the machinery of state, and the ultimate transformation of enforced choices into generational consequence. Her story is not an isolated tragedy, but a structural illustration of how the medieval aristocracy reproduced itself through legal mechanisms that could elevate or annihilate households. The record is merciless in its clarity. Marriages contracted while children were infants, wardships sold and executed, attainders issued and later reversed, wills composed to secure memory. That cold machinery produced people who were at once victims and agents. Her tomb at the Blackfriars, recorded by contemporaries and remembered by subsequent genealogists, marks the final reconciliation of a life bound to institutions that could deny and then restore favour. The reflection this history leaves is stark. Political life in her age was administered in ink and seal, and the human cost, detention, early motherhood, the execution of kin, remains a factual ledger that the archive preserves instead of the consolation of narrative. Such is the truth of Elizabeth de Badlesmere, a life constrained by the necessities of lineage, translated into documents that outlived her, and made consequential by the descendants her enforced marriages produced.